Welcome to the Architectural Association. This evening we are continuing the discussion that we initiated on Friday. My name is John Palmesin, and together with Anne-Sophie Rønskog, we run a unit here at the AA in the diploma program, and we are the founders of an independent organization called Territorial Agency that is convening this series. And part of the series also convened by some colleagues across the school. So you'll see that we try to organize the series in multiple voices. The series is called Plant the Planet, and the alliteration is really there to hide a divergence. On one side, the planet is on the move, is no longer made a fixed object. We cannot think it as a finite condition of planning that is subjugated to our policies. It is traversed by multiple energies and dynamics. And on the other side, planning is becoming a more and more esoteric practice, one that concerns itself with putting things in sync, managing timelines and pathways rather than allocating clarity in space and in time. It's more about being on the move itself. So we have two situations where the current ecological crisis cannot be resolved. It used to be in the good old 20th century that we imagined to be appeased by living in nature. And today we find there all kinds of troubles. So the question is really one that stems from a series of discussions initiated by students at the Architectural Association, in particular a group that has self-organized in what is called the AA Action. And in conjunction with a number of similar initiatives across the architectural education realm in Britain, formed the Architectural Education Declares paper that is calling for a radical revision of our curricula, our policies, and the way that we cooperate. And so this is just not a response, but is thought in conjunction with that series. And the series is also a sustained argumentation. It's a sustained argumentation, so it's not a cross-section, it's not a survey of what is happening in the field, because the field is not a preconstituted one. It's not a subject. We are, on the contrary, inviting friends to the table, and everyone is welcome. At the end of the discussion this evening, you are really welcome to join the table and continue the discussion. In order to sustain this argumentation, we want to say two things. On one side, that we have to name the current situation for what we think it really is. That is the warm war. At the end of the Cold War, the notion of just fizzled out and became immaterial. And we think that we should name it clearly, and at the same time as we name it, we should call for not only a truce, but a way of being at peace. And the question is who we, and with whom. And this is where the discussion is going to take us. So it's a laying out of the beginning of a thinking together of what an architecture of peace might mean in the 21st century. Anne-Sophie.
Yeah, I think just first some thanks. I mean, first to the AA for us being able to do this, but also to Graham Foundation, who actually funded us in the first part of this Plan the Planet, and we held a seminar here at the AA a few years ago. And I think we have found a great way to continue that research on Jacqueline Turret in order to really look with you students what this situation is that we're talking about. I think we really ought to thank the students who last spring initiated all of this new thinking, and who really debated quite serious things here in these rooms on Friday. It was all about intersectionality, it was new forms of politics, and it was how to embed an ecological understanding and how to deal with decolonization. So it was big topics on the table, and it lasted many, many hours, and many, many people were here. So it's really great that these things are in these rooms. And it's a serious interest there. And that is also why we are very happy to have Lucia Pietroiusti here tonight. Because she's the curator from Serpentine Galleries, and she is directing her general ecology.
My own general
Yeah.
self-improvement project.
And we think it's great to have you here because you prove how to infiltrate these thoughts in an institution, and especially in your case, an art institution. And that's why we look forward to hear about your general ecology, or the Serpentine's general ecology, and your projects, I think, from which one the Sun and Sea Marina in the Lithuanian Pavilion in the Venice Art Biennial, which got the Golden Lion, is a really outstanding project, and you basically took the art audience by storm with this project.
So welcome to Lucia, and please join us in welcoming Lucia to the Architectural Association.
And of course, thank you so much to both of you, John and Anne-Sophie, for the invitation, and of course to the AA and everybody here for having me. I thought, because it's quite terrifying to speak to architects, because you're all much smarter than me, I thought that we could start by playing a song, because it then relaxes me, and then everything goes much better. So that is a brief song from Sun and Sea Marina, which, as Anne-Sophie said, was the Lithuanian Pavilion at the Venice Biennial. And those are the words of the longer version of the song, which I'll tell you a little bit about later. But this is the ridiculous version of the PowerPoint, because it just has nice images that I really like. I started to believe in magic spells, for example. I started to believe in magic spells a while ago, and understood, and I suppose the more academic way of calling that is the performative. So things that, as you're talking, you speak something, or you present the representation or the symbol of it, but the action of it or the fact of it in the material world also happens at the same time. So believing in magic spells, I started to is I suppose a way of looking back at the last 2 years of General Ecology project at the Serpentine, what it didn't know it was trying to do, what it did know it was trying to do, what it did, and also what it's still doing and sort of trying. 2.5 years ago, I think, I had a child, and it taught me a lot of things that I didn't know before. Things like, it's really interspecies communication, like is a thing, you know this, is what you need to get your head around, and also, and that communication doesn't really need an enormous amount, except for the question of care, and being with or spending with together. So something like communication is actually a sum of observation, care, and time, and has in fact very little to do with the symbolic linguistic framework. And I also learned a thing or two about what it is to think past the scale of one human life. Now, granted, you're actually only thinking about the scale of 2 human lives, but nevertheless, what might, if lucky, end up being 120 years is a little bit longer than 75 years, and therefore it's a useful defamiliarization of the question of time, or at least that's how I over-intellectualize the experience of being a new mother. As a result of this, I started to write a project for the Serpentine Galleries, where I was already employed as curator of public and live programs, so all the kind of discursive conference performances, films, and all of this. And I started to write, and you were two of the people that I had the very first conversations with, but started to write this project as something that would try to set itself the task to embed questions around the environment, interspecies questions, questions around ecology in a very, very, very wide sense. But of course, we're narrowing now as the kind of, I suppose, public perception of the environmental crisis and questions around climate justice kind of intensify. Weave those things into and out of everything else that we did at the Serpentine. Now, if you go to an art institution and you say, I would love it if everything we did was about the environment from now on until forever, it wouldn't work. So I was trying from the position of a curator, which if you think about it in an art institution is kind of, it's not even middle management, it's sort of lower middle. It's like the semi-mezzanine floor of middle management. And at any rate, your, let's say, agency is in the field of the representative, or the representational rather, the symbolic and the discursive. How do you then start from that position and try to do that? And so the way that I went about it was I had a little bit of budget from the public programs, a little bit from other things, and I started to slightly funnel things towards things that, yes, they sounded a lot like public programs, and in fact promoted themselves and manifested themselves in the shape of conferences and talks and films and performances and things like this, but that they would, instead of being sort of separate from each other in some way, work on the event scale, they would actually repeat and continue to repeat more or less the same set of questions and concerns. It's not new. Nobody has invented anything here. But the idea was also to create around, it's also a bit of therapy here. So the idea was to create around the Serpentine, which is an art institution that prides itself on working on, let's say, at the interdisciplinary edges of the contemporary art field, but was to create a community of interest and practice, and also of networks and individuals and experts, far, far greater experts than myself, around the gallery, that would over time then invite, let's say, the gallery itself to start to think of itself as a institution that had something to say, or at least a platform to give to those kinds of conversations. So at this point, once you have the institution thinking of itself as one that has anything to say useful about it, then you're kind of halfway there, because what you've done is a kind of slow, and not alone, certainly this had to do with a huge cross-organizational effort, but you've sort of, you've done the thing that you were doing to you, to the kind of extended body of the institutional, right? So you've sort of managed to think of your body as a little bit wider, and that body begins to think of itself as a body as well. So once that happened, and we were in a phase at which we were trying to determine what the 50th anniversary of the Serpentine was going to be, and that is happening in 2020, so next year, I suppose the environment had also been on everybody's mind. I mean, one of the things that happened in between, and that definitely did help this whole thing, was winning an award via an independent project that, however, manifested within it the potentials, or the way in which certain questions around the poetic and the musical could intersect with architectural questions, with questions around space and viewpoint particularly, in an opera performance such as this one. So I'll just describe this to you really quickly. What you see is an has anyone been to see it? Okay, so has anyone seen it on Instagram? because yesterday I gave a talk and I was like, has anyone seen the Lithuanian Pavilion? All the hands went up, and then I went live and it just all came down. So this is an indoors artificially lit beach in which the sort of actors, singers, vacationers that you see are observed from the mezzanine above. So those columns are actually precariously holding up a mezzanine onto which the audience stands. So they're looking about 5 plus the height of a person above the ground onto these singers. And there is a soundtrack, and you heard a piece of it. And what the hour-long loop, it's kind of like an installation. So the whole opera performance loops. It's about an hour long, but it just keeps going on and on and on and on and on. You never see them beginning or end. That's the kind of conceit, I guess. And what it narrates, what the libretto narrates, is the individual thoughts and musings and worries and whatever of people on the beach, as you would imagine them to be. So kind of trifling, pointless, a little bit annoyed at times, and just these kinds of things that are perceived. And underneath there's this kind of veiled, but sometimes not so veiled, anxiety around pollution, volcanic ash clouds, a world that's changing, a world that's dying, and so on. So without being incredibly didactic necessarily about it, but being quite humorous maybe, it sets off a situation of defamiliarization of your own relationship to the incapacity to cognitively make sense of something as wide and complex and unequally distributed as climate change. That's what makes sense. That's how I would tell that story, but I'm sure the artist would do something else. Another series that we've been doing was called The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish, and that's, you see there, part 1. This is the wall from part 3. The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish is a joint project with a brilliant writer and editor called Filipa Ramos, who's been working on animals, and particularly animals in zoos and how they figure in contemporary art for quite a long time. And what we did was we started to set up these kind of conference-style symposia, festival things, but also with arts and performative bits and poetic bits and that try to one at a time pry slightly open certain assumptions of anthropocentrism. The first one, perhaps addressing something like you need language in order to communicate, which we've already spoken about. The second one, which is not here, was subtitled "We Have Never Been One." So, The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish, Part 2, "We Have Never Been One," which was perhaps undoing or trying to pry open the assumption that when we say I, we're talking about an individual, and when we say the planet, we're talking about a number of individuals. And so if symbiosis and cooperation and coevolution are much more the norm than the exception, as science and all the other knowledges besides that were annihilated before Western science know very well, then notions of competition and individualism in terms of our political structures and all other kinds of forms of governance are actually notions that self-justify by presenting an image of quote-unquote nature that is actually an image of themselves. So what other forms of being together, really, in all of its extensions, can be possible if we begin from the idea that we ourselves are collaborations with an enormous number of cells, bacteria, parasites, and so on, and viruses. The third one, The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish with plants, was a lot more to do with distributed intelligence and care, and with trying to unwind the question of distribution and communication by thinking about communication with the vegetal world and plant intelligence. And we're working now towards many others. But to cut a long story short, all of these things, the audience grows, the Venice thing happens, and all of these things kind of lead us to a situation in which, by no means as a result of only the ecology project, but we're talking about emergence here. So it emerged that the anniversary program for the Serpentine in 2020 would be entirely dedicated to the ecological. Bam! So at that point, you start to ask yourself, well, then what can you do that is real? What can you do that actually can make a I don't want to say a difference because I hate that kind of solutionist conversation, but that can sort of really hold its feet firmly to the ground whilst doing what an art institution does. We're not going to reinvent ourselves between now and the beginning of 2020. There isn't very much time. What we do is present works of art. Well, how can we operationalize that work in order for those things that we present or that we support or that we platform to be able to do what they do? So we're planning on working with an enormous number of sort of activist organizations, also non-activist organizations that do a lot of ecological or embedded work. We're planning for things that are part of this, let's say, we're calling it a meta-initiative that holds within it lots of initiatives. We're planning for all those to deploy themselves and manifest themselves and be looked after by different strands of our programming and to manifest in completely different ways. So you might have things that are completely invisible for 5 years and then finally emerge as a piece of infrastructure. You might have something that is absolutely poetic and performative and that acts on the kind of call to action level and so on. But the idea is that in each one of us, of those moments, we're going to ask ourselves, what is the kind of magic spell that is held by this particular project or initiative? So I'm going to stop. But I wanted to say something, which is that someone called it social practice once at me, and I thought, gosh, it would be the worst social practice. I'm a huge, I have colleagues that do this so well and that have done this for so many years. I call this ecological practice. I call it, let's assume that we're always already within a within, and then figure out what it is that position within that within is and where that agency is. So not so much the structural possibilities of that within, but maybe even more what the institution or the structure offers while it limits, offers by way of limiting, and where that agency comes, and then how do you work a little bit like a... I always say if you're going to do any work on mushrooms, you have to work like a mushroom. So if you're going to be thinking about a parasite, you have to work like a parasite, and in order to find out what that actually means, you kind of have to... You'll know when it happens, just like, So at that point, I would probably leave it there, except for saying that then that brings with it the question of what does ecology mean to me and what did I call it general. First of all, because I'm not an expert, so general. It was, of course, inspired by a book by Eric Hurl that had to do with the kind of generalization of ecological principles in cybernetic thinking. Really brilliant book, if a little bit media theory heavy. But ecology to me has to do with a lot of things, and this is why it's not a definition, but it's a set of connections. Fuzziness, and the perhaps special advantage that comes with a kind of blurry view. So artists are really amateurs at everything. They're not necessarily specializers. Amateurs are also lovers, but when you're an amateur, you can, in the fuzziness of the things that you're looking at, you might just have the chance to see more the connections or the things that are similar than the distances and the divergences. And the big joke that I say at every single talk is that you probably need interspecies communication to get a microbiologist and an oceanographer to talk to one another. So, fuzziness, messiness from an Anna Tsing point of view. There isn't a single kind of point on the one-to-one scale of the planet that doesn't hold within it a kind of incredibly messy, incredibly friction-full entanglement of ecologies and an enormous amount of things beside. Chorality, in the sense that if we're talking about solutions to the climate crisis, we're in the wrong line of business. It's a question of really relearning forms of part-making, puzzle, jigsaw exercise, and patience, and also that there is never, ever going to be such a thing as a one. I'm saying the obvious here. Connection at a distance, of course. Systems goes without saying that the notion of the ecological that I tend to work with thinks a lot about systems at the same time as it thinks about the environment and thinks about systems as environments. And then I would probably end with this question of like metaphors are real. They really are. If you start to think about it, symbolic representations of things. If you say the genealogical tree, it has a relationship with an actual tree, and we just have to work out what that is. I mean, I'm not going to go into it. It's not as vague as I'm saying now, but if you start to think that metaphors are real, then all of a sudden, if you think, well, what does a... Do you remember that question that happened in Venice when I started to think about this? Like, what does a fish eye view, was a bottom-up view of climate, of sea level rise could look like? And all of a sudden, if you start to think, well, what does from the fish point of view, sea level rise look like? Well, it probably won't look like sea level rise. It will look like what the things that dissolve in the water will be, right? So all of a sudden, you change these things, and then you start to think about their material actualness. And then a bottom-up view, which could be a political statement, like what is a bottom-up view of sea level rise, and how does that have something to share with a different kind of bottom-up view, which would be more like chemical. This is where I start to...
I have a question about
Thanks.
These elements. First of all, thank you, because I think you're laying out so many elements of the practices. But I have a question about what you just said about the non-tropical condition of say metaphors.
Non-tropical?
Yeah, they're not a trope. They're real.
I thought you meant not on the tropic.
Yeah,
that also.
Also. The condition through which you're equating processes across a number of entities. You know, somehow you say, look, there might be a tree that we call, say, a fig tree, but there's also a family tree. And you're saying it's not a metaphor, or better, you're saying actually metaphor is, going on there. It seems to me that you're trying to have a material approach, a materialist approach to what is a contemporary condition. Say, look, it is a tree. It is following the same practices of life and of form given and communication and ecological functioning as a tree. But still you are within the linguistic. So I'm interested in that condition, because it seemed to me that the amazing work that you've been doing and leading over the last years is trying really to dissolve and somehow let many of those entities interpenetrate one another, vanish across borders, and somehow become the solvent. So what does it mean to have a form that is simultaneously present across a number of entities, rather than thinking that there are entities that are self-concluded and then saying that they're similar? What does it actually change in your mind when you have to approach, let's say, the zoological society? What does it mean that they will somehow start infiltrating Serpentine and you will start infiltrating them? Rather than, look, we're just working together.
I don't know. I can tell you let me try and answer at different levels of that in a messy way, which, given the talk, is going to be totally intentional. There's a very simple question around institutional collaboration. And really, it is just working together. But institutional collaboration is actually very much the exception in most fields, and certainly in the contemporary art field, because of this question of competing for funds or attention and so on. When you're sharing, the sort of funny maths of the whole thing is that when you're actually sharing an audience because you're doing something in collaboration with someone else, that audience actually doubles because it's counted by both organizations. So in a way, it's sort of worthwhile. You then also think about collaborations in the sense of oftentimes, well, from the point of view of an art organization, oftentimes you find that art tends to be sort of invited into the scientific or the political process only as a way of data visualization or, I suppose, public understanding of science, or sort of to jolt, something is really intense, it can jolt you out of the general that happens when you're looking at a graph or whatever. And I really don't think that art does that at all well. I mean, I think it does it, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not made to do that necessarily. And when it's used for that, then it almost, to me, reinforces the distance between this whatever graph and the artwork. It almost reinforces the distance because it creates a kind of relationship of translation. Whereas the strange and fuzzy and weird things happen when the processes interpenetrate. Like the thought changes on both sides. And that is true for, you know, these kinds of institutional or artistic forms of collaboration. But maybe also could potentially be true at the level of like dissolving oneself or dissolving, you know, like I was really interested in why you called this How to Think with Others. Actually, Amal wanted to ask this question, so my colleague Amal, who's amazing, wanted
the
to
question really comes from an observation of two elements. On one side, of course, your work and the work of Serpentine Galleries and at large. And it seems to me that what's going on at the moment in the General Ecology project is significant as an institutional model, because suddenly the institution is not thinking itself as a body. It's thinking itself as a series of multiple, simultaneous, non-hierarchical collaborations. And I think that is really exciting. And of course, this is not yet completely public, and the public intercepts it now and then, only in formalized moments. But the underlying collaborations are really astonishing.
But you know, there's so many practices in museums historically that have been working with collaborations and for a very, very, very long time. And it might be that they need to exist, that there are certain forums that can be public for those forms of collaboration and certain others that can not. What I'm interested in is perhaps inside, it's like almost like a work inside, because it feels to me like there's a lot of practices these days that work in these kind of embedded, strategic, parasite mushroom-like way. And there isn't so much of a language to address those practices, not to like historicize and kill them, but to share that sort of methodology or that kind of prototype. So if you're like, if you're maybe an artist, but you work a lot with the local government, or you have someone in residency, and you know, if you do all these kinds of things, you might know what you're doing, and you might have this kind of like, oh yeah, I recognize you thing. But then you don't. But you don't. We aren't quite at the. And I don't know. Then it goes back to your question of language. We're not quite at the level where we have the kind of toolbox to say, well, if you want to do this within an institution, then this is what you do. And so I've been trying to say that a lot.
Yeah, but the incredible thing is really that you are avoiding completely the usual attitude, which we also see, and we've experienced it on Friday in the discussions, and that is to make ecology a subject. To identify an issue as if it would be something that you have to clearly delineate and say, now I'm going to study it in detail. I'll open a course about it, and I will become an expert. And then you discover that you're not an expert. You should give up your architectural studies and move over to natural sciences. But what is interesting is that you're taking the question as an organizational question. So the question, the second part of why we would like to call this even thinking with others, how to think with others, has really to do with the fact that the moment that the other is no longer a subject, it's no longer a body that is clearly identifiable, the question of alterity becomes far more interesting.
Yeah,
because alterity is not only something that you recognize within a grid of preconstituted differences, but becomes something that is completely brought up by common thought or by common formation. And that's maybe the interesting element for many of the people in this room who are preoccupied on how to establish, say, a turn in architectural practices in order to confront the crisis. It's not this simply, we're no longer building in concrete, we are suddenly building in bamboo, or we're no longer cutting down trees in order to have roads. No, we're going around them. No, it's not the usual modus operandi. We have to dissolve the conditions. So the question of the other is an important one, but to me the most important element is how to think with the other. And your question of the little pufferfish, what is the circle in the mind of... And there's no way that you will ever know what is the mind of a pufferfish, what is the mind of an ocean, what is the mind of a railway system, what is the mind of complex technological compounds, or what is the mind of an institution. But I'm really impressed by the way that systematically the way that general ecology project operates is by dissolving, by opening up multiple relationships. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about those three parts, about language, about...
What's the other two?
You made it up.
I don't know. So
the first one was language. The second one was how to think
with others. Yeah. So the alterity question, I guess there is a kind of psychedelic or plant-like answer, and maybe a Cohabitation-inspired post-colonial possibility, and lots besides. But because Cohabitation was speaking last week, it's fresh in my memory. He spoke about the necessity to acknowledge or recognize the other within before any kind of real work can be done in relation to decolonizing thoughts and also modes of governance. So that is, I suppose, one of the things that the General Ecology Project or an individual kind of needs to be doing. And the psychedelic version of that is if you start to not necessarily acknowledge, but recognize and really know the kind of consciousness and intelligence of plants. And I'm not saying this in a kind of crazy hippie way, but really, like, Merlin Sheldrake is about to publish a book that shows that essentially mushrooms have neurons. Mushroom systems have neurons. We just don't call them neurons because they don't look like ours, but it doesn't really matter. There's forms of intelligence, forms of generosity for sharing, caring in the plant world as well. Then all of a sudden you have like a really cacophonous amount of information or sounds that come at you from any walk down the park, or even if there's a plant in your room, right? So you aren't really alone anymore. And I guess that's another experience of pregnancy, is like you realize that those are two brains thinking in one body, and so the one brain to one body relationships is all of a sudden broken, and therefore it can be broken in infinite number of other ways. So I suppose that alterity comes very much from a kind of ego breakdown. Mm-hmm. The language question comes from disciplinary habits. So I think the space or the scale question would apply in a kind of, if you emerged out of the architectural discourse. For me, it was language, because that's what I studied. I studied literature and poetry, so I was like, for me, it's the metaphor that's kind of the point. But then that's just an accident.
But the second aspect, the first one was how to think, how to have an interspecies collaboration, how do you talk to plants, but also how do primates communicate with humans, how do we make music together with them, how does the internet operate when we have an interspecies and intermachinic space. But the second element is that we've never been one. Which somehow takes the initial premise of the beginning of your series of convenings and cuts right in the middle of the problem. It's not, on one side there is one species and on the other side there's another one. Suddenly we are traversed constantly. And this is then for, I think, architectural thinking a major challenge, because in one way or the other we are still obsessed with the machinic notion. One of the most favorite way of drawing in architecture is the axonometric, in particular the exploded axonometric, as if we will be engaging with the construction of an internal combustion engine. And we'll draw everything made of parts, pre-constituted, that need to be reassembled. There's no ecological thinking whatsoever. There's not even a thermodynamic thinking. It's just elements that need to be reassociated. And architects like that because we are somehow, I think, always under the geometrical. The geometrical is a pre-given, and then we have to reassemble these pre-constituted elements. But suddenly when you describe the world of general ecology, nothing holds on. What you thought was let's say, a species speaking to another species, or at least a very intelligent human scientist talking to a very intelligent group of dolphins, is completely mesmerizingly in fluctuation.
Yeah, but it's funny.
And I think that is extremely interesting.
You know, it's funny because but we don't perceive it as such, right? So it's like, it's all nice and well to say we're constantly traversed and there's this sort of mesmerizing or psychedelic kind of subatomic, if you like quantum underbit, where we actually aren't all the things that we think that we are. But most of the time, we are. We cluster around the thing that is needed. I guess I guess at that point it sort of comes to faith, like the enormity of the climate disaster and the enormous complexity of it is completely it's outside of the realms of the possibilities of the cognitive brain, or the cognitive activity of the brain in general. Like, we're not going to get there. And so what are the modes of belief? What are the kinds of artistic forms? What are the things that can push towards something that you don't see, like electricity, but you know is there and you don't put your finger in the plug, right? So it's like, how can you bridge the gap between the things that you know you're never going to get, but without necessarily putting a god there, or a goddess, but just putting the planet on the other side of that kind of conversation. And so there is a sort of, it's funny because it sounds like the most like unactivist ecology project on the planet, maybe, but what it tries to do in the end has a kind of course there's an activist hope. Someone called it active hope to me the other day. I thought it was really beautiful. There's an activist hope that has to do with a lot of things, with like not becoming incredibly nihilistic, and therefore, there's an activist hope in relation to the fact that we can actually get it even when we don't get it, because we get music, because we get divinity, because we get the infinite, the possibility of the infinite, and so on. So what does that mean in terms of the built environment? I literally have no idea, except for the fact that this is a circle to us, or a work of art or whatever. But if you start to think of it from the pufferfish's view, it's actually a dance, because it's really small, and therefore it's probably not going up and looking, oh, what a nice little circle I've made. So it's like that movement is embodied. And then Rupert Sheldrake, Merlin's dad, told me apparently that for him the shape of then you go paranoid and you discover that there's loads of circles in fish's lives, and there's lots of shapes of circles in fish's lives, and so there's dolphins that make these circles that they swim through as like language and play. And you remember Diane. And then Rupert Sheldrake said, well, if the fish looked up, what they would see is a circle past the surface of which you can see the other side. And this is maybe an interesting comment for architects. But the top above you, that circle, you could see the air, so you would see like a bird flying in. And then around, because of the nature of light, around that circle, the rest of the surface of the water would be mirroring. So you'd see the bottom, and then inside the circle you'd see the other side. No? It's fascinating. I don't know where to put that in a...
I think that's exactly the question today. How do you start from, let's say, watching Attenborough on BBC and being fascinated, rightly so, by the puffer fish circles, starting articulating then a completely different organizational structure within extremely established institution right in the middle of London. I think that is what is at stake for us within the Architectural Association. How do you make the jump? In our mind, that has to do with the fact that we don't recognize the other. That we inhabit a polysemiotic condition, but also that the science and the material condition are indistinguishable. We're no longer in that condition of, let's say, post-World War II, where in these rooms there was an idea of the cybernetic as a condition of imagining the signs of science. That is really the difficulty. But it also implies that because we don't recognize the other, most of the time we don't recognize that we ourselves are conflating into conditions multiple modes of being, multiple ways of organizing our relationship with and our attachments and our association with others, which I think demand a lot of attention. The cure, the caring that you were talking about at the beginning is phenomenal when it's applied to one's own institution. And institutions don't operate automatically. It's not that they have inertia. They can collapse at any moment. If we don't pay attention, they stop.
But also very importantly, any institution has two aims. One of them might be the stated aim and the other one is its own survival and resilience, right? So you have to also know which bit you are going for first, with an enormous amount of care and love, etc. And collaboration inside. It's also permacultural, like in the sense that some things you might be able to respond really quickly to a certain piece of news or to a new Attenborough documentary and make an event, but to change the way in which we, say, relate to our own carbon footprint or whatever takes a much longer time. And I don't see that as a form of hypocrisy. I see that as an invitation. So if an audience member came to us and was like, yes, but what is your carbon footprint and what are you doing about it? The answer is actually thank you, because that is a much slower, much harder work to do that we're doing internally that we all want to do. But with that in kind of encouragement that can also be called public scrutiny or whatever else in mind, it sort of helps you further, I guess. And also it helps you make the point that your own resilience is also dependent on those things. It's like when, you have to remind, like, we do actually need a planet. Like you can defend consumer society or this shop as much as you like, but we do actually need a planet, and so do you. And so there's a kind of like, once you make the jump between the resilience and, not sustainability, but like between resilience and the thing that resilience is kind of held by, then you have another way of looking at yourself differently, right?
So the invitation, I think, is now an appropriate moment, because I would really like to invite at the table those who have immediate questions, but also those who are just wanting to be quiet. Because part of thinking with the others is also recognizing that it's not always that action, in particular public action, has to be, say, in an Arendt way, only linked to public speech. On the contrary, I think that we are in a moment where not to act is as powerful as acting. So please close a little bit the circle. Come and think it through the mind of the fish.
Circle around the circle.
Please, don't be shy. Come at the table. And
also you can dump my bag on the floor if you like it. Let me do that.
Supposed to be a seminar after all.
Which one do we like that?
That one there.
I also have.
Do you have questions for them?
Well, I just wanted to ask you if any of this made any sense, in the sense that I'm very happy to also talk in a much more like concrete way. I just like the mess that happens when we don't. So I think, I mean, also lots of questions for you in the sense of like, for example, the descriptions, I'm going to fall off this chair. The description of today brings up a lot of things that I'm not very familiar with around the built environment and urban space. And I wanted to maybe ask you what, like, first of all, why the urban space is the question? I mean, maybe that's more a question for you both. Yeah, I don't know.
Does anybody want to answer why the urban space? It came up also on Friday, and there was a heated discussion about the urban versus the rural. Our position, I think that is a shared position across the school, is that city, this beautiful little word with 4 letters. It's so small, but it has to carry so many ideas and practices that we call it still the city, but we mean all other kind of stuff. But yet, I think that the majority of, will fall into the trap of reverting to the city versus the rural dichotomy and dualism, and the rural and the city being also formally and architecturally distinct, as if the city will be this area with high density, surrounded by an area, say, more or less with low density, with a lot of open fields and forests and so on, which is a very interesting notion, and it's quite interesting also to see where that notion comes from. It's a very recent notion. It's a very recent notion that coincides most probably with the loss of that condition. And in this particular country, the loss of the distinction was then the motive for radical transformation of a polity, of relationship between property and market. So the urban is a shortcut to discuss a very complex set of relationship with larger spaces of operation of architecture, I think. That's my version of thing. Does anybody else want to answer the question? Why the urban? Why architecture? What's the built environment? Does it need care?
So the urban and architecture are not necessarily the same thing.
No.
I attempt to give my own version of why it's urban and why we have urban versus the nature. I'm currently investigating the notion of technology in my unit. And personally, my definition of like why there's a clear distinction between the urban and between the nature is precisely there is a distinction between us, like I and the others. I think urban is like a manifestation of human production, projecting outwards, and then at the center of the urban, like the capitals, capital in the nation sense, the capital city, the big cities, major cities are the most concentrating part of these kind of manifestation of, if you in a better term, humanity, which calls for something that sounds positive, but for something that sounds not that positive, it's like your eager, your rigorness that's against something that's naturally existed. So it seems to me it's like a phenomenon that's just happening because we, like, as a human, as how humans start to become different from the animals, we have our sense of us, our sense of individuality, and we are building that kind of individuality, that sense of ourselves by producing stuff, by contrasting us with the others. And I think urban is like a huge, there's a term called agglomeration, like, a huge collection of all the others. It's, if you call that like collective unconsciousness. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
It's so funny, this metaphor is a real thing, because as soon as you said capital, I was like, okay, capital, money, yeah, check. Capital city, fine. The relationship between capital and capital we got. And then capital is also what you put at the beginning of a sentence. And it's quite interesting to think, I don't know what that, it's like very fresh thought, I have no idea where it goes. The capital letter is what announces to you that something is coming. So it's like, what is it that the city space announces or announced that is coming or was coming, whether it's the kind of artificialization of the environment or the densification of, what it is that it begins.
I was listening earlier to a very old interview to James Lovelock, and he says, you know, we are urban. It's not that we've always been urban, but now we are urban. The majority of humans are urban. So not only we have become urban in our social structures, we actually moved and changed our day-to-day lives into urban behavior. The majority of humanity used to be equally distributed on the planet in the temperate zones. We are now clearly on a coastal species living in urban structures. But he says, in a very surprising way, as usual in plain English, the fact that we are urban means that most of us have air conditioning. Air conditioning at home, air conditioning in the car, air conditioning in the airplanes, air conditioning in the airports, in the tube, and so on. And air conditioning is interesting because it allows you to somehow regulate internal conditions that are good for us, but also makes us think that it's irrelevant whether outside is a scorching summer. We have air conditioning. And on top of that, to be urban means to be extremely mobile. We can move. But other species can't move. So this summer was extremely hot. In 20 years from now, that will be every summer like that. And we can move. We can
Some people.
switch on, no, but we can switch on electricity to have air conditioning. We can move our environment. Or we could imagine, because we are
some
bipeds,
of us can move our environment.
yeah, but we can imagine even gigantic migrations.
Right.
But the plants can't. Not in such a high speed. And this is where I think the urban plays a major role. On one side, because we've urbanized so quickly, and unfortunately, there's no second first try. And we tried it at the beginning, and we got it wrong, completely wrong. There's never going to come again a first try in urbanization of humanity. We've done it wrong the first time. The question is really, what do we do from here? So I think that's why there's a preoccupation in architecture about the urban condition, and many of our colleagues are even investing a lot of efforts in understanding its etym, its origin, its conditions and interconnections with other forms of architecture. But still, it's an open question about that, I think.
I suppose if you think of temperature in the same way as you would think of like toxic elements, then you'd find yourself in a situation where air conditioning is quite similar to cleaning up certain parts of the world and shoving those toxic elements to somewhere else, right? And that's exactly what happens. The hot air just gets pushed out. Now, Povinelli, of course, says if you, like I do, live in and work in the Northern Territories of Australia, then you know that where I am is, well, where I am, where she spends her time, is the end of the sewer pipe from the point of view of those forms of toxicity. And so the latest book that she's just finished writing, that I don't think is published yet, has to do with this kind of radical proposal that says, well, you know, left-wing kind of liberal ideas around cleaning up things, even this T-shirt, is all nice and well, but actually what we should be considering is taking a share in those toxic leftovers. And not only a share,
There's
but
no externalities. There's no externalities.
And there's no externalities. Like the whole thing is, and also you take a share of it, it then ends up in your milk and the baby, and it kind of goes back into the earth. So, like, accept that this thing is a sort of constant, endless cycle.
Are there further remarks? Questions? Carlos.
I think it's very interesting that what you've set up in terms of your description of the collaborations and opening up a conversation and so on. And I like that sort of definition that John's made of urban. I think the urban condition is open to discussion, i.e. the way we think in the urban condition. I think we should separate that from urbanization, which is, I think, is a real problem. I think the conversation so far has been very positive, actually. But it seems to me that urban is up for grabs. In a way, the conversation that's been had at the table is actually to question what urban is, rather than the other way around. I don't think urban is to inform. And I think there's a real issue of urbanization, that this conversation is taking place here. At the same time, I've sat in this room where someone has said, well, we've got to build Africa, so we're going to urbanize it.
We.
Yeah, we. I mean, we as society as a whole. You know, these cities are growing, people are moving towards them, therefore we must build them. And it's quite interesting, because I think that is a total negation, actually, of what you are trying to define by urban. So I think the urban condition, the way that urban adapts, and urbanization are three completely different things. And maybe there has to be some militancy against the urbanization. It's not open up for dialogue. Maybe it needs more direct approach or more direct action, is what I feel about it, I think. So I think the word urban in a generous sense is probably a very good word to start off these discussions that are actually more open-ended.
But I guess this image that you have on the screen, this is a really an interesting place. It's part of probably the first completely integrated production site in the world. It's in the Arsenale in Venice, which is the first completely integrated factory. But you treat it as half exterior, half interior, and I like the ambiguity of that. I like the fact that it's not clear whether you're dealing with that space as a condition that needs further explanation, or whether you want to make it explicit that actually that's not really a beach. Let's not pretend. But it could be in a few years.
The pavilion also is not just in the Arsenale, it's in the military zone of the Arsenale, and that zone had never been open to the public before. And because our fixer in Venice was friends with the colonel, we got them to rent it to us for the first time. And they didn't quite know, the Marina, genuinely, the military apparatus of Italy, didn't quite know what was going to happen, and certainly didn't expect these really bizarre and entirely performative situations which happen outside, where you have colonel coming this way and bikini going the other direction, right? So, and it's in those moments that you realize, okay, well, without doing something that is so dramatic, the gesture there renders absurd the whole apparatus of the military. And we get punished all the time. I was saying this at the talk. And we get punished in the way that you get punished by, like, schoolmaster. The kids of one of the artists were found playing with a ball in the fields that are... So, you know, like, what is the field? What is the stage? Where is the bikini allowed and where is it not? No? And how do these things are, like, they're all performative inside the pavilion and outside. So the kids are found playing in their bathing suit outside with a ball in the fields, the playing fields of the Marina Militare. The King of Belgium happened to walk past. It's a big embarrassment for the Marina. And they punish us by locking the toilet with the running water. So all of a sudden we don't have running water in the pavilion, and that continues. We have smaller other ways of... But you all of a sudden realize, like, running water is quite a... I mean, this is a joke situation, kind of course, but you sort of realize that you're at the interface of something that is much more bizarre than even a theater. And that getting the locals that had never been, the locals that live around the corner that had never been into the zone to see this zone is in itself a gesture of disarmament without necessarily calling it so or trying. For example. And then there's the afterlife of, I mean, this is getting quite specific, but the afterlife of the sand is now, hopefully, well, that's the plan, is to open 2 new playgrounds in Venice.
Where's the sand from?
The sand is from Lithuania.
From Lithuania, from the
yeah, everything that came, everything came in
What's
one
the carbon footprint?
truck. Well, this is what I'm getting to. is everything that came to Venice came in one truck. You can't get sand from Venice because it's sinking. Came in one truck, but the idea was to never send it back. So what we're doing now is working with the city of Venice really to open 2 new playgrounds in a city that has very little infrastructure for kids. So we were trying to do as much of that as possible whilst remaining quite humble. You know, it's not a zero carbon project, for sure.
Do you have other remarks, question at the table?
Yeah.
It's just a sort of a simple question to you, but I'm interested, you spoke that you were from like a literature background, and then through the action of artistic projects, we were using the metaphor of nature in like urban or architectural environments. And I'm personally, like I come from an artistic background, not architectural, and I'm very fascinated by the idea of working with metaphors. And I'm just curious to hear a bit more from you about why you think they are so powerful, as opposed to just, say, presenting this, say, like at a beach. I understand the circumstance, but why do you think specifically a metaphor is so powerful?
You know what, the really amazing thing that you've just said that I hadn't realized before is that the fact of putting a beach inside a closed space is actually a form of metaphor, and that hadn't even occurred to me before, so clearly it wasn't my intent. I mean, that has to do with the conditions of the work itself, which I guess would probably come down more to a question for the artist. But why are metaphors so powerful? I feel like because we live within them all the time. Because we say the leg of a table, and we don't have another word for it. And because language in general is has these kinds of distances all the time, or closenesses. And through those moments in which you misunderstand something that might be said on a symbolic level and you take it literally or vice versa, you actually find out that they're connected somehow. You know, and even the leg of a table might be made of wood, and when you chop the tree down, then maybe you're actually chopping its leg down. Like maybe those are things that need to be thought about just a little bit more, you know? This like mutilative relationship that we have with material production, where we actually mutilate them. Maybe. I mean, I'm quite suspicious of the notion of empathy. Why? Huh?
Why are you suspicious of empathy?
No, I mean, it's a great thing, but like, I'm suspicious of the notion of empathy, and the reason why I'm suspicious of the notion of empathy, but not at all of the notion of care, for example, is because empathy, you'll hear the word empathy mostly in discourses around technologies, which are supposed to give you empathy by alienating you even further from the thing that you're supposed to have empathy towards. So like like VR will get you right in the middle of a conflict zone and therefore will make you have empathy. Yes, but actually the message there is take up a thing and put on a machine and don't look at the people right in front of you, but look at the thing inside. So, you know, it's like the language of empathy is then is used with like Hollywood films that then exonerate you from the feeling of, you know what I mean?
It seems quite similar to the cybernetic language of emergence.
Can you take a...
The question I have is we're trying to find common ground, and a lot of the rhetorics of the sort of cybernetic arguments throughout history rely a lot on emergence. The way you describe empathy is quite similar to the way I'd imagine emergence performs. So I'm wondering if there's any differential between... Basically what I'm asking is that there's a danger of, like, to go on from what Carlos was saying, is that the urban is open, but urbanization it emerges and it extends continuously. And I'm asking what the difference is between urbanization and the rhetorics of your practice.
That's a really tough question.
Because I feel that it's a really tight kind of the sinew between those limbs it's not so different. It seems quite similar. I don't like public speaking, by the way, so I'm sorry.
No, I kind of intuit it's just a really difficult question. And the thing that I would probably say is, like, when you're working within the context of a within, sometimes you might actually be like tripping into the political opposite of the thing that you're trying to do. And that's okay, because politics aren't so clear at the moment. And so you trip and kind of, but to know that you're kind of treading thin and dangerous ground, I think is also quite important. Does that make sense at all in relation to your, maybe not, maybe I misunderstood you. Maybe I misunderstood your question. But like urbanization, help?
How do you avoid, in thinking from within, the outside? It seems to me that all these conditions, especially the evocation of the cybernetic. The cybernetic is a beautiful collage of the cybernetic conference, which is just nothing else than an esoteric seating calling for the other that has to be invoked to be brought in. It seems to me that the entire discussion on the cybernetics, even the second and the third level of cybernetics, that is for the uninitiated, which I think it should be a compulsory study at AA, cybernetics of the third rank, since it started upstairs at the bar. It seems to me that the question is always this modernist dream of a complete circle, of a completion of the circle, and suddenly everything else disappears. You're completely within. Well, I'm interested in the border between inside and outside. I think that's where architectural thinking really lies, and I think that situations like yours are interesting in architectural thought because they question the border. They question not simply by connecting and interconnecting and opening up, but they question really what is the border. And you mentioned, yeah, suddenly it's where the children can play football. And suddenly what used to be a rather established assumption in Venetian space of what is the military becomes where the children can play ball. I think that's a very interesting transfer and an opening up of a different kind of border, and one that is not contiguous. Maybe your question about urbanization, whether this can also be seen as a practice of urbanization, I think it's true. I think you are touching on a real important point. But the question is, how do we maintain that condition of ambiguity, of not knowing, without immediately reverting to, yes, it's urbanization, hence we should block it?
You know, going back to Homi Bhabha again, there's two things that you brought up. I'm basically just going to quote him. One of them was this thing of the border, of being interested in the border, and he was saying something along the lines of a kind of interdisciplinary exchange is necessary, not for the sake of itself as an aesthetic exercise, but because the problem, his words, the problems exist exactly in the place in which those different disciplines kind of merge and converge and meet. And so there is no such a thing as a possible disciplinary approach to a problem. And then the second one I forgot, but it was really good. What was this urbanization question again. Yes, the other thing that was asked, I thought it was really interesting. The journalist, brilliant person who was interviewing him asked, given the encroaching language of hate and alt-right politics and all of this, how do you, and given your work on dissolving the boundaries of the self and recognizing the otherness within and all of this, how do you fortify yourself against those things? And then I'm just like, yeah, this is a question to the theoretician of the notion of hybridization and these kinds of porous boundaries, being asked about how you fortify yourself, how you fortify that kind of thinking against something else encroaching, no? And so you also, and then all of a sudden you realize that the fields of that question are kind of outside of where the question was trying to be in the first place, which is kind of like saying the child.
But the point is really that the military and the ecological are the same. So you might be surprised that the military is somehow withdrawing for 10 minutes from their disused old hangars. But the military is always there because there's no way that we can imagine an ecological thought without using and perusing and going through a military approach. The entire apparatus of ecological thought. The fact that we have to evoke the cybernetic command system in thinking, it's part and parcel of the problem. And I think that this is really the difficult part where we are trying to use the series about planning to stay with it for a while, to understand that you cannot really give it up. The question is really so closely interconnected to the military, to the industrial, that we can only imagine the conditions of climate disruption from within an industrial apparatus.
And if you are in alliance, in some kind of tentative and perhaps unstable and perhaps also quite fragile alliance with those forces that instead operate from the activist, so quote-unquote temporary without, or literally outside of parliament, if you can create some kind of situation in which this within that feels a lot like it's selling itself, or has a kind of temporary, then what is it that can all of a sudden go through those borders? That's a loophole. Because if you're working on the ecological from the very embedded, very within, very symbolic and so on, and sort of hypocritical, as it were, from an activist standpoint, but then you are able to maintain some temporary fragile alliances with those standpoints themselves. And I'm saying this from a within of a within. The wall has porous boundaries. And I think it's kind of a little bit like it kind of comes down to what the problem in politics is these days. It's like there's a chunk of politics that doesn't care if it disagrees with one another, but somehow all it needs to do is win the election, and then it does. And how do you maintain the kind of polyvocal, phenomenal brilliance of the emancipatory potentials of everybody else while stopping Trump? Just like...
Yeah, but you started with a chorus. Yeah. So what is a polyphony?
Well, I guess that's it. Like it's the same temporary fragile harmony that happens when you sing together, but you don't pick the same pitch to begin with. Mm-hmm. You might end up in harmony by accident, and to kind of make space for that accident, I guess, is the is a thing that one can do.
There's a question from the back.
I don't know if it's a question or a statement exactly. Like, I don't know where I'm going to go with it, but one of the biggest issues that comes with urbanization is that it functions or it evolves with cost effectiveness, like it's built on cost effectiveness, which goes against what is efficient for the ecology, for its sustainability, etc. But why is it that artists, I feel like it's almost non-interdisciplinary, that people need an exhibition or exhibitionism in order to kind of have their attention drawn to something. I don't know why it would take an indoor beach or an artist bringing an iceberg from like ice to melt in front of the Tate. Like, I don't know why it takes so much. Like, why does it need VR for you to feel empathy towards people who are dying in a conflict zone? So I think maybe my question is, doesn't this go against what you guys are talking about in terms of interdisciplinary, creating harmony, but what you kind of exhibit is the exact opposite?
So, just the VR bit, personally, I don't agree with the notion that you need to put on a set of goggles to understand what it means. Definitely not. I completely understand, I don't completely understand, but feel with the question that you've just mentioned. And my personal answer to that is because when you win a lion for doing something like this, they let you do whatever else you like. And and so it's a position of enormous privilege, and that whatever else you like might take the shape, this is not, I'm just inventing here, but might take the shape of a certain kind of working with or leveraging the institution to create some kind of artist auction that then benefits the activist organization. Who knows? Then you can do lots of other things that don't look like this and that you might not even necessarily get to see except as a story. And those are the sort of things, those are the kinds of things that we're also thinking about in terms of the anniversary initiatives, for example. So given something like this, how can then we extend the categories of the aesthetic to include something that might be a kind of mutual leveraging of two institutions in order to benefit a third, or, all these kinds of thinking about policy, like how do you change policy, how do you change forms of governance, both inside and outside of an organization. Like those are just kind of, I feel like they exist as potentially artworks or poems, but they don't look like them necessarily.
I guess that the indignation and the feeling of injustice always comes with a delay effect. I think that's what you're describing. How dare you put up a beach when it's obvious that you should have been completely outraged since at least the 60s? Didn't you get it yet? No? And I think this is the delay effect, no? It's obvious in front of everyone that we should not be living our life as we are doing. Hence, we shouldn't do it. Hence, we shouldn't speak to each other about how to get out of here. We should just compliment each other through our outrage and our... and this is where the problem, I think...
depends if you see it as a criticism, though, which I don't.
No, but it's not a criticism. I think that's where I think the question is of the capacity to act from within that condition. Yeah. So I think that the real difficulty is how do you get those who are pushing against you and play with them? Manager.
I also think there's a real power to using art and architecture to also tell stories, that through something that's like, as exciting and charming as a beach and listening to an opera, you actually, even if you aren't aware of these serious issues, you suddenly learn about them through kind of active storytelling. I guess my question is linked to that, it links to a point that you made earlier, John, about speed. And Chia, you talked about mushrooms having neurons, and I was in a great meeting last week with a landscape designer who was telling me that trees have nerves, and that if a bird sits on a branch on one side, the other side is aware of it. It just takes 2 weeks for that message to move across, which I thought was amazing. And I think there's something really interesting about the different speeds at which neurons communicate or nerves operate across different species. And I think sound is something you've used in a lot of your work to try and tell that story, whether it's through the General Ecology podcasts or through this amazing piece. And I was just curious as to how you thought sound could maybe be a vehicle to start interspecies communication, or if it's a way to start to manifest these different speeds at which things move and communicate.
Interesting. It's true. There's been a lot of sound. We did a commission with Chris Watson, which was kind of getting you into the salmon cycle of salmon, and then a number of other things. For me, that has to do with a kind of centering or some kind of embodied, sort of soft possession, I guess. Because of course it's sound is vibrations, and vibrations enter your body, and so maybe speed is an interesting one. Have you probably all read the Overstory, Richard Powers?
Yep.
Yeah. It's amazing. It's really good.
It's a book about trees.
It's a book about trees. And there is a sort of sci-fi sub-narrative in it, in which, you know, whatever, like an alien species comes to Earth, and because they're so fast, human speed movement appears, in fact, so slow to them that they don't realize it's movement at all, even though they might acknowledge it as such, because like our plants move and we can really see it, but we also don't see them as moving, and as a result assume that the human species doesn't have any feeling, chops them all down and use them as furniture. I mean, it's like, when you see it like this, you go, oh, really? Yeah. It's kind of obvious, this kind of de-anthropocentering, but it's not, it's also just not possible most of the time. So I don't know how that connects with the sound. It's a good question. I haven't thought about it.
I think I like to say, actually, which is what I was trying to say about what John talked about the urban. I think your piece here is fantastic in the number of questions it asks, regardless of whether it's done by an artist or whatever it does. And if we could actually produce spaces or urbanism that had the same resonance, it would be fantastic. So, I mean, the comment I was saying was a compliment to your piece. I think your piece is totally the opposite of Martin Parr. I love Martin Parr, so please don't get me wrong. But it's not an observation. It's a piece that actually asks every single question we should be asking by just looking at this image. And I think that's the strength of maybe the dialogues that can take place, which is actually very hard to do at the moment in our conventional way of looking at urbanism and things like that. Whereas this fabrication of a space in Venice that seems to ask all the questions: should we be tourists? Should we worry about the environment? Is the sun, the beach, all the things that it's asking? I think that's its strength, really. And I think that communication of not critique, but of having an edge, I think is really very important in terms of actually raising the conversation up.
Thank you.
It's been mentioned several times, I think, throughout that it's about transforming from within. It's about almost, you know, creating the change from within one structure which is already set in place. For me, I wonder if that's actually possible, and I question that. And it's, you know, we talk about, you know, transforming from within the urban first, but also the urban is set on perhaps values which have already become too powerful to transform. Maybe they will kind of overpower us. Or as well, I think with you know, this notion of transforming from within the industrial. I mean, is it? I mean, we're already, I think, reshaping this idea of the associations which are built around us. You know, is it about completely undoing everything and then starting from completely outside of the system, which can create a really meaningful transformation?
You know, when you say it like this, I'm like, oh my God, are you, as in me, the our world equivalent of someone saying like business can solve itself? Like, please break up. No. It's a very it's a very specific experience story about a field that has relatively low stakes, I guess. And I think it's an entirely different story when you're talking about capital, like, you know, the Financial Times saying we can fix ourselves kind of thing. That was just a tiny paranoia that you just... I need to rethink everything.
It's a question that resonates with yours. And it seems, and this is also the reason why we are having this series, that there's a number of issues that we need to tackle with courage. One of them, of course, is independence. How much does a notion of independence lead you to the anti-politicking of, say, contemporary politics, where everybody needs to disengage from institutions and somehow by automatic symbiosis, and there's no chance that the far right, the alt-right, is using exactly the same language. No? You will self-organize. How much reaching out to the other is equivalent to the intrusion of the say, World Bank or the financial institutions into pre-existing polities. So we are always lying at the edge of conditions. No? One side you think that you're moving towards an independence and how beautiful that would be. And suddenly you recognize that you're approximating something that you really abhor. On the other side, you are calling for consolidation, or what was it, embeddedness, and immediately recognize that that is also something that it doesn't work. So the series is really thought as a seminar without a preconceived set of language. We have to build our own lexicon. We have to build our own structures of thinking in order to surpass this difficulty and have courage to think anti-politics at that time that are so difficult. What does it mean not to act when everybody is calling for action? And so I think that the doubt...
Although we should all be in the street tomorrow. I mean,
or also this morning should have been. I think that is where the entire action is. It's getting late, and someone last Friday said we don't have much time. And
but it's okay. So we accept that we can be complex beings. We don't have much time. We accept that we can be complex being in the context of a friendship or a love affair. But all of a sudden, when we relate to the political, we're supposed to be entirely consistent beings with one message and one strategy. That is just not possible. So how to do away with this question that you're either consistent and therefore impossible, or strategic and somehow shift strategically and hopefully semi-consciously in an incredibly messy political landscape. And then start to sort of go, okay, well, let's kind of start from that perspective and see where that goes somehow.
Good.
The more you know, the less you know.
Thank you, Lucia.